My name is Sarah, I'm 28 years old, and last Saturday my mother destroyed me in front of 50 family members and friends. Standing at my grandmother's memorial service, she grabbed the microphone and declared that unlike my perfect sister Jessica, I had never lifted a finger to help our family. The room fell silent. Aunts avoided eye contact. Cousins whispered. But what my mother didn't know was that I had been secretly documenting everything for 2 years, and her public humiliation was about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this crazy family drama that literally changed my entire life, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're ready for a story about family betrayal, hidden secrets, and the sweetest revenge served ice cold, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this tale of family karma is going to blow your mind. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming, and you definitely don't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes out. Growing up in the Morrison household meant living in Jessica's shadow every single day. My older sister was everything I wasn't, or at least, everything my parents believed I wasn't. She was the cheerleader, the honor roll student, the one who never forgot birthdays or missed family dinners. I was the difficult one, the ungrateful daughter who supposedly cared more about my career than family obligations. The truth? I had been the family's silent backbone for years, but nobody bothered to notice. While Jessica posted Instagram photos of her family visits, I was the one driving 3 hours every weekend to help Dad with his physical therapy after his stroke. While she sent thoughtful cards, I was paying Mom's medical bills when her insurance fell short. While she organized the perfect holiday gatherings, I was the one cleaning up the aftermath and dealing with the emotional meltdowns nobody else wanted to handle. But in my family's narrative, Jessica was the saint and I was the selfish one. Mom would constantly compare us. Why can't you be more like your sister? Jessica always makes time for family. Jessica never complains about helping out. What she didn't mention was that Jessica's version of helping usually involved showing up for the fun parts and disappearing when real work needed to be done. The pattern had been established since childhood. When I was 12 and Jessica was 15, I spent my summer vacation helping Dad rebuild the back deck while Jessica went to cheerleader camp. Guess whose contribution got mentioned at every family gathering? When I was 16 and working 2 part-time jobs to save for college, Jessica got a car for her birthday because she needed it more for her activities. When I graduated valedictorian from university, the celebration dinner somehow became about Jessica's new promotion at her marketing job. I tried talking to Mom about it once, during a rare moment when we were alone. It feels like nothing I do ever matters, I told her while we folded laundry together. She looked at me with that disappointed expression I knew so well. Sarah, you're being dramatic. Of course we appreciate you. But you have to understand that Jessica has always been more naturally giving. Some people are just born with bigger hearts. That conversation broke something inside me. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they revealed about how my mother saw me. In her mind, I wasn't just less helpful than Jessica, I was fundamentally less good as a person. Less loving, less caring, less worthy of recognition or praise. So I stopped trying to change their perception. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every bill I paid, every favor I did, every sacrifice I made. At first, it was just for my own sanity, proof that I wasn't going crazy, that my contributions were real even if they went unnoticed. But as the evidence piled up, I began to see a different purpose for my careful record-keeping. The breaking point came during Dad's second hospitalization last spring. I had arranged my entire work schedule around his treatment, coordinating with doctors, managing his medications, and spending every evening at the hospital. Jessica visited twice in 3 weeks, both times bringing flowers and taking selfies that made it look like she was his primary caregiver. When Dad was finally discharged, Mom called Jessica first to share the good news. Jessica's been such a rock through all this, Mom told the neighbors. I don't know what we would have done without her constant support. I was standing right there, still in my scrubs from another 12-hour shift I'd pulled to cover my absences, and it was like I was invisible. That night, I made a decision. I was done being the family ghost, the daughter whose sacrifices went unnoticed while Jessica's minimal efforts were praised to the heavens. I was done enabling a system that used my guilt and sense of obligation to extract free labor while giving my sister all the credit for being family-oriented. I didn't stop helping immediately. That would have been too obvious, too dramatic. Instead, I began a slow, strategic withdrawal. I started keeping detailed records not just of what I did, but of what Jessica didn't do. I began taking screenshots of conversations, saving voicemails, and documenting every instance where I was asked to handle something Jessica had promised to take care of. The most revealing pattern emerged around Grandma's declining health. Everyone knew she was failing, that her time was limited. Jessica talked constantly about how much she loved Grandma, how important family legacy was to her, how she wanted to make sure Grandma's final months were perfect. But when it came to the actual work, the doctor appointments, the medication management, the grocery shopping, the lonely afternoons sitting by her bedside, guess who showed up? I created a spreadsheet. Date, time, task, Jessica's excuse for not being available. Big presentation at work. Plans with friends she couldn't cancel. Feeling under the weather. Car trouble. Always something urgent enough to justify her absence, but never urgent enough to earn criticism from our parents. Meanwhile, I rearranged my entire life around Grandma's needs. I learned to cook her favorite recipes when she could barely eat. I listened to the same stories about her childhood for the 100th time because they brought her comfort. I held her hand during the scary medical procedures and was there for every piece of bad news. But Jessica was the one who got praised for her emotional support during family phone calls. Jessica was the one Mom bragged about to the church ladies. Jessica was the one everyone assumed would be devastated by Grandma's eventual passing because she was so close to her. The irony was suffocating. I was living my grandmother's final chapter with her, while Jessica was performing grief and devotion for an audience that was too invested in their preferred narrative to see the truth. And I realized that when Grandma died, this same pattern would play out at her memorial service. Jessica would be comforted and praised while I would be expected to handle all the practical arrangements without acknowledgement. Unless, of course, I decided to change the script entirely. Grandma Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, and I was the only one holding her hand. Jessica had promised to visit that weekend, but canceled last minute for a work conference in Miami. Mom and Dad were dealing with their own health issues and couldn't make the drive. So it was just me and Grandma, the way it had been for most of her final 6 months. As I sat in that quiet hospital room, watching the woman who had helped raise me take her last peaceful breaths, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. Grandma had always seen me clearly, had always acknowledged what I did for the family. "Sarah," she had whispered just days before, "you have the strongest heart of all of us. Don't let them convince you otherwise." The funeral arrangements fell to me, naturally. Mom was too overcome with grief to handle the details, and Jessica was coordinating the family communications, which apparently meant posting tribute photos on social media and fielding sympathy calls. I spent the week planning everything: the service, the reception, the flowers, the catering, the memory board, even the playlist of Grandma's favorite hymns. Jessica's contribution? She designed a beautiful program cover and gave interviews to distant relatives about how devastated our family was. She had also volunteered to give the main eulogy, which everyone agreed was perfect since she was so good with words and had always been Grandma's special girl. But here's what nobody knew. Grandma had left me something more valuable than money or jewelry. She had left me validation in the form of detailed journals she'd kept for the past 3 years. Journals that documented every visit, every favor, every moment of care she'd received from each family member. Journals that told the real story of who had been there and who had just talked about being there. The night before the memorial service, I sat in my apartment reading Grandma's careful handwriting. Sarah came today and helped me reorganize my medications. She stayed for dinner and we watched our show together. I thanked God for her patience. And the next entry, Jessica called to check in. Such a sweet girl, always so busy, but still makes time to call her old grandma. The difference was subtle but crushing. I got full paragraphs describing actual time spent together, actual help received, actual conversations shared. Jessica got single sentences acknowledging phone calls and promises to visit soon. But the entry that changed everything was dated just 2 months ago. Sarah has been here every day since my diagnosis got worse. I worry she's sacrificing too much of her own life to take care of me. I see how tired she is, how much she's given up. Her mother doesn't understand what Sarah does for all of us. I pray someday they'll see her clearly and appreciate the daughter they have. That's when I knew what I had to do. Not for revenge, though I won't pretend that wasn't part of it, but for truth. For Grandma, who had seen everything and wished someone else would too. For my own sanity, after years of gaslighting that made me question my own worth. And yes, for justice, because the people who deserve recognition should get it, and the people who take credit for work they didn't do should be exposed. I spent that night preparing my own eulogy, not the one I was scheduled to give as Jessica's supporting act, but the one that would tell the real story. I gathered my documentation, the hospital visitor logs I'd requested, the receipts for all the groceries and medications I'd purchased, the photos I'd taken during countless afternoons at Grandma's house while Jessica was allegedly too busy to visit. But the most powerful evidence was Grandma's own words, written in her shaky handwriting during those final months. A love letter to the granddaughter who had actually been there, mixed with gentle sadness about family dynamics that favored performance over presence. The morning of the service, I watched Jessica practice her eulogy in the mirror, perfecting her grief-stricken expression and dabbing her eyes with tissue. She had written beautiful words about legacy and love, about being grateful for the time she'd had with Grandma, about the lessons she'd learned from their special relationship. "I'm going to tell everyone about that last conversation we had," Jessica said, not realizing the irony. The last conversation she was referring to had been a 10-minute phone call 3 weeks earlier, while I was literally living at Grandma's house to provide round-the-clock care. Mom bustled around, making sure Jessica's outfit was perfect, that her makeup was camera-ready for the family photos. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she told Jessica. "Grandma would be so proud to see you honoring her this way." Then she turned to me with that familiar look of mild disappointment. "Sarah, dear, could you make sure the catering table is set up properly? We want everything to be perfect for Jessica's tribute." Even at Grandma's memorial service, I was still the help and Jessica was still the star. But not for much longer. The service began beautifully. The church was packed with people whose lives Grandma had touched, including many who had no idea about the family dynamics playing out in the front row. Jessica delivered her eulogy flawlessly, bringing tears to eyes throughout the congregation with her eloquent words about love, loss, and the precious nature of family time. She talked about Grandma's wisdom, her strength, her unconditional love for her family. She shared carefully selected memories that painted a picture of a granddaughter who had treasured every moment with her grandmother. The audience was captivated, moved by Jessica's apparent depth of feeling and beautiful way with words. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. People nodded approvingly at Mom and Dad, silently communicating their admiration for raising such a thoughtful, loving daughter. I watched from my seat in the front row, feeling like a stranger at my own grandmother's funeral. Then came the reception, where Mom's public humiliation was waiting to destroy what little dignity I had left. But I was ready. In my purse, I had copies of everything, every piece of evidence that would expose the carefully constructed lie my family had been living. The moment was coming when I would finally stop being invisible, stop being the family scapegoat, stop enabling a system that rewarded performance over presence. Grandma's journals were going to tell the real story, and everyone was going to hear it. I just had to wait for Mom to hand me the perfect opportunity. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, the same room where I'd spent countless hours helping Grandma with church committee meetings over the years. About 50 people were scattered around tables, sharing stories and comfort food while soft music played in the background. It should have been a peaceful celebration of Grandma's life, but I could feel the tension building as Mom worked the room like a political candidate. She moved from table to table, accepting condolences and praise for Jessica's beautiful eulogy. "She has such a gift with words," Mom would say, dabbing her eyes delicately. Eleanor always said Jessica had a poet's heart. They had such a special bond. I watched her rewrite history in real time, transforming Jessica's minimal presence into a deep spiritual connection. Meanwhile, I was handling the practical details as usual. I refilled the coffee urns, restocked the dessert table, and made sure elderly guests had comfortable seating. Several people thanked me for the lovely arrangements, the perfect music selection, the thoughtful memory board filled with photos spanning Grandma's 91 years. "You did such a beautiful job organizing everything, Sarah," said Mrs. Henderson from Grandma's book club. "Eleanor always talked about how devoted you were to her. She was so proud of the way you took care of her." Before I could respond, Mom appeared beside us with that bright, slightly strained smile she wore when she was about to redirect a conversation. "Oh, we're all so grateful for Jessica's emotional support through this difficult time," she said smoothly. Sarah helped with some of the logistics, but Jessica really carried the family through Eleanor's final months. She has such a natural gift for caregiving. Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "But I thought Sarah was the one who—" "Jessica was amazing," Mom continued, her voice getting slightly louder. "Always visiting, always calling. Eleanor lived for those conversations with Jessica. She used to say that Jessica was the daughter she never had." I felt my cheeks burn, but I said nothing. This was Mom's standard operating procedure: redirect any recognition I received back to Jessica, even when it required bending the truth beyond recognition. But something felt different today. There was an edge to her voice, a desperate quality that made me pay closer attention. The breaking point came when Father Martinez, the priest who had given the service, approached our family table. "I wanted to personally thank whoever coordinated Eleanor's final arrangements," he said warmly. "The music selections were perfect, and I know she would have loved the photos you chose for the memory board. It's clear that someone knew her very well. This should have been a simple moment of acknowledgement." Everyone at the table knew I had spent the week planning every detail of the service. But instead of letting the moment pass naturally, Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made several nearby conversations pause. "Father, I need to set the record straight about something," Mom announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "I've been listening to people thank Sarah all afternoon, and I can't stay silent anymore." My blood turned to ice. The entire fellowship hall was now focused on our table, conversations dying as people sensed drama unfolding. Jessica looked mortified, Dad seemed confused, and I felt like I was about to be executed in public. "Sarah has been getting credit today for being such a devoted granddaughter," Mom continued, her voice getting stronger as more people turned to listen. "But I think it's important that people know the truth about family contributions. Unlike Jessica, who sacrificed her own social life to spend time with Eleanor, who called every single day to check in, who brought light and joy into those final months." She paused for dramatic effect, surveying her audience of family friends, church members, and distant relatives. Every eye was on her, waiting for whatever revelation was coming next. Sarah never lifted a finger for them. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. The silence was so complete I could hear the coffee pot gurgling in the kitchen. 50 people stared at me, processing what they'd just heard. Some looked shocked, others confused. A few nodded as if this explained something they'd been wondering about. "I'm sorry people have been thanking the wrong person," Mom continued, seeming to gain energy from the audience's attention. "But I couldn't stand here and let Sarah take credit for Jessica's devotion any longer. Jessica is the daughter who truly cared for Eleanor. Sarah was always too busy with her own life to make time for family obligations." The humiliation was complete and public. In front of everyone who mattered, family members, family friends, church community, my mother had just announced that I was a selfish, ungrateful daughter who had contributed nothing to my grandmother's care. She had taken my lifetime of invisible labor and erased it with a single, devastating speech. Some people looked at me with pity, others with judgment. A few seemed uncomfortable with Mom's public declaration, but nobody spoke up to contradict her. Why would they? She was the grieving daughter, the mother who would know better than anyone what her own children had contributed to their grandmother's care. I sat there feeling smaller and smaller as the whispered conversations resumed around me. I heard fragments. Always thought she seemed distant. Makes sense why Jessica was so emotional during the eulogy. Some people just aren't naturally nurturing. Jessica was mortified, but not enough to correct the record. Dad looked uncomfortable but said nothing. And Mom sat back down with a satisfied expression, as if she'd finally unburdened herself of a truth that had been weighing on her for months. But what Mom didn't know was that this public humiliation was about to become the best thing that ever happened to me. Because now I had witnesses to her lies. Now I had 50 people who had heard her version of events and would be able to contrast it with the evidence I was about to present. I reached into my purse and felt the weight of Grandma's journals, the hospital visitor logs, the receipts, and all the other documentation I'd been collecting. My hands were shaking, but not with embarrassment anymore. They were shaking with anticipation. Because Mom had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and I was about to make sure everyone in this room knew exactly how wrong she was. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, but my resolve hardening with each second. The room was still buzzing with uncomfortable conversations about Mom's announcement, but I could feel the shift in energy as people noticed me rising from my chair. The few people who caught my eye looked away quickly, probably expecting me to flee in shame or break down crying. Instead, I walked to the front of the room where the microphone still stood from Jessica's eulogy. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but Grandma's voice echoed in my memory. "You have the strongest heart of all of us, Sarah. Don't let them convince you otherwise." "Excuse me," I said into the microphone, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'd like to share something with everyone before we leave today." The room fell silent again, but this time the energy was different. People were curious now, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Mom looked alarmed, probably realizing that she might have pushed me too far. Jessica was wide-eyed with panic, and Dad was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "My mother just told you that I never lifted a finger for my grandmother," I began, looking out at the 50 faces staring back at me. "And I understand why she believes that, because I've spent years doing things quietly, without asking for recognition or praise. But today, at Grandma's memorial service, I think it's important that you hear the whole story." I pulled out my phone and opened the photo album I'd prepared. This is a picture of the visitor log from Grandma's hospital room during her final admission. As you can see, I signed in 47 times over 3 weeks. Jessica visited twice. A murmur went through the crowd. I could see people leaning forward, suddenly paying much closer attention. Mom's face was turning red, but I wasn't done. "Here's my receipt folder for the past 6 months," I continued, holding up a thick file. "Groceries for Grandma, medications when insurance didn't cover everything, gas for the 3-hour round trip I made every weekend. The total comes to just over $4,000 of my own money." More murmurs, louder now. I saw several people looking at Jessica, then at Mom, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with what they'd just been told. "But the most important evidence comes from Grandma herself," I said, pulling out one of the journals. She kept detailed records of family visits and calls. "Would you like to hear what she wrote about the daughter who supposedly never lifted a finger?" I opened to a page I'd bookmarked and began reading in Grandma's exact words. "Sarah came again today, even though I know she's exhausted from working extra shifts to help with my medical bills. She brought homemade soup and stayed to watch our stories on TV. I don't know what I would do without her daily visits. She never complains, never acts like it's a burden. I worry that she's sacrificing too much of her own life to take care of me." The silence was deafening now. I could see the shock on people's faces as they realized the scope of the lie they'd just been told. Mrs. Henderson's mouth was literally hanging open. Several of Grandma's church friends were looking at Mom with expressions of disbelief and disappointment. You know what? This moment right here, this is where everything changed for me. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been the one doing all the work while someone else gets all the credit, you probably understand the mix of terror and liberation I was feeling right now. Take a second to hit that like button if this story is hitting close to home, because we're about to get to the part where everything I'd been planning for 2 years finally comes together. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Here's another entry, I continued, flipping pages. Sarah organized all my medications into daily containers and created a chart for the home health aide. She also talked to my doctors about adjusting my pain medication because she noticed I was still struggling at night. Jessica sent a beautiful card this week reminding me how much she loves me. I let that contrast sink in for a moment before continuing. And here's my personal favorite, from just 1 month ago. I'm worried about Sarah. She's been here every day since Dr. Peterson said my time was getting short, sleeping on my couch so I'm never alone at night. She thinks I don't notice how scared she is, but I see her crying quietly when she thinks I'm asleep. I wish her mother could see what a remarkable daughter she raised. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. I looked directly at Mom, whose face had gone from red to pale white. Grandma was right about one thing: you couldn't see what kind of daughter you raised. You were so invested in your fairy tale about Jessica being the perfect family caregiver that you completely ignored the daughter who was actually doing the caregiving. I held up another piece of evidence. These are screenshots of text messages over the past year. Jessica canceling visits, Jessica asking me to fill in for her at doctor appointments, Jessica requesting that I handle the boring stuff so she could focus on providing emotional support. Would you like me to read some of those emotional support sessions? Several people were now openly staring at Jessica, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. But I wasn't finished with her yet. My favorite text chain is from last month, I said, pulling up the screenshots. Jessica asking me to please take care of all the funeral arrangements because she was too emotionally devastated to handle the details, but she wanted to make sure the service was beautiful because she planned to give an amazing eulogy that would really honor Grandma's memory. The gasps were audible now. People were looking at Jessica and Mom with a mixture of shock and disgust, finally understanding the level of manipulation and deception that had been going on behind the scenes. But the most telling evidence, I said, is this final entry in Grandma's journal, written just 3 days before she died. I opened to the last page and read slowly. Sarah is exhausted but still here with me every night. I told her today that I see her, that I appreciate everything she's done, that her sacrifices haven't gone unnoticed even if her family doesn't acknowledge them. She cried and said she just wanted to make sure I knew I was loved. I told her that real love shows up, real love does the hard work, real love doesn't need an audience. I hope someday her family will understand the difference between performing love and living it. The room was completely silent except for the sound of several people crying quietly. I could see tears in the eyes of Grandma's friends, people who had known our family for decades and were suddenly seeing it clearly for the first time. So yes, Mom, I said, looking directly at her. You're absolutely right. I never lifted a finger for them, if by them you mean the public performance of grief and devotion that Jessica specialized in. But if you mean actual caregiving, actual sacrifice, actual love in action, then I lifted everything I had. And Grandma saw it, even if you never did. I closed the journal and looked out at the assembled crowd. I'm sharing this not to embarrass anyone, but because the truth matters. Because invisible labor should be acknowledged. And because my grandmother deserved to have her final wishes honored, including her wish that someday her family would see clearly and appreciate what they had. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping quietly. But it built quickly until nearly the entire room was applauding, some people standing, all of them looking at me with new respect and understanding. Mrs. Henderson was crying openly, nodding at me with what looked like pride and vindication. But the best part wasn't the applause or the vindication. It was the look on Mom's face as she realized that her public humiliation had backfired spectacularly, exposing her own blindness and cruelty instead of my supposed selfishness. She had tried to destroy me in front of 50 witnesses, and instead she had destroyed the false narrative that had protected Jessica for so many years. The truth was finally out, and everyone could see it clearly. The silence that followed my revelation felt like it lasted forever, but it probably only lasted 30 seconds. Then the room exploded into conversation as people processed what they'd just heard. I could see clusters of family members and church friends whispering intensely, gesturing toward our table, glancing between me and Jessica and Mom with expressions of shock and disapproval. Mom sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through emotions, shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been the first glimpse of understanding. Jessica had her head in her hands, probably calculating how badly this was going to damage her reputation in our small community where everyone knew everyone. But it was Dad's reaction that surprised me most. He stood up slowly and walked over to where I was still standing by the microphone. Without saying a word, he wrapped me in the biggest hug he'd given me in years, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I had no idea how much you'd been doing." That hug broke the dam I'd been holding back for months. All the exhaustion, all the grief, all the years of feeling invisible finally came pouring out. I sobbed into Dad's shoulder while he held me tight, and I could hear him crying too. Through my tears, I could see people throughout the room wiping their eyes, finally understanding the real family dynamic they'd been witnessing. Mrs. Henderson was the first to approach us. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor talked about you constantly at book club. She was so proud of everything you did for her, so worried that you were wearing yourself out taking care of her. We all knew you were the one who was really there for her." More people began gathering around us, sharing their own observations and memories. "Mr. Cooper from Grandma's church committee, I always wondered why Jessica got all the credit when you were the one bringing Eleanor to church functions when she could still get around. Aunt Martha, one of Dad's sisters, Eleanor called me every week, and she always talked about Sarah's visits, Sarah's cooking, Sarah sleeping over to make sure she wasn't alone." The validation was overwhelming, but also deeply healing. These people had seen the truth all along. They just hadn't realized how different the family's internal narrative was from reality. Now they understood why Grandma's journals were filled with gratitude for one granddaughter and polite mentions of the other. Meanwhile, Mom was facing a very different kind of conversation. I watched from across the room as several of her longtime friends approached her with expressions of concern and disappointment. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I caught fragments. "How could you not know? That poor girl has been killing herself for your family. Eleanor always talked about Sarah's sacrifices." Jessica had disappeared entirely, probably hiding in the bathroom or her car. I didn't blame her. Having your entire reputation exposed as a fraud in front of 50 people would be devastating for anyone. But part of me wondered if she'd finally understand what it felt like to be humiliated in public, to have your worth questioned by people whose opinions matter to you. The most powerful moment came when Father Martinez approached me again. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've been Eleanor's priest for 15 years, and I knew her better than almost anyone. She talked about you constantly, your visits, your care, your sacrifices. She was so proud of the woman you'd become, but also worried that your family didn't see your value clearly." He paused, looking toward Mom, who was now sitting alone at our table while Dad continued to comfort me. "She asked me to pray for your family to develop better vision, to see past surface appearances to the substance beneath." Today, I think those prayers were answered. As the reception wound down, people began approaching me individually to share their condolences and their newfound understanding. Several offered help with anything I needed, any support I might want as I processed everything that had happened. The contrast was stark. Instead of being seen as the disappointing daughter who'd neglected her grandmother, I was now recognized as the devoted granddaughter who'd sacrificed everything for family. But the most important validation came from an unexpected source. As I was packing up Grandma's journals, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it that I'd somehow missed earlier. Inside was a letter in Grandma's shaky handwriting. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're probably dealing with the family dynamics we've talked about so many times. I want you to know that I see you, I've always seen you, and I hope someday the rest of the family will see you too. You have given me the greatest gift possible, your presence, your time, your love in action rather than words. Don't ever let anyone convince you that what you did didn't matter, because it mattered more than you'll ever know. You're the daughter I would have chosen, the granddaughter I was blessed to have, and the woman I'm most proud to call family. Stand in your truth, sweet girl. The people who matter will recognize it." Reading those words in front of 50 people who had just witnessed my mother's public attempt to erase my contributions felt like Grandma's final gift to me. She had seen this moment coming and had left me the validation I would need to survive it. As families began leaving and cleanup started, I realized that everything had fundamentally changed. The old dynamics, the old narrative, the old pattern of Jessica getting credit for my work, it was all destroyed now. Mom couldn't unknow what she'd just learned about Grandma's journals. The community couldn't unsee the evidence of who had really been doing the caregiving. Jessica couldn't pretend anymore that her minimal efforts had been meaningful contributions. But more importantly, I couldn't unknow my own worth anymore. After years of gaslighting that made me question whether my sacrifices mattered, I now had undeniable proof that they did. I had Grandma's words, the community's recognition, and my own carefully documented evidence that I was not the selfish, ungrateful daughter I'd been painted to be. The public humiliation that was supposed to destroy me had instead revealed the truth that would set me free. And judging by the looks on Mom's and Jessica's faces as they avoided eye contact with departing guests, they were beginning to understand that their carefully constructed lie had finally collapsed under the weight of reality. The real reckoning, though, was still coming. The drive home from the reception was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Dad rode with me since Mom had driven separately with Jessica, and we spent most of the trip in stunned silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with guilt and confusion. "Sarah, I need you to help me understand something," he said as we pulled into my parents' driveway. "How did I miss all of this? How did I not see what you were doing for Mom?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw an old man who was genuinely bewildered by what he'd just learned about his own family. "Dad, you've been dealing with your own health issues. And Mom has been very selective about what information she shares with you." What I didn't say was that Dad had always been conflict avoidant, happy to let Mom manage the family narrative as long as it meant he didn't have to navigate difficult conversations or hurt feelings. But seeing his genuine distress, I realized that his ignorance might have been willful blindness rather than malicious neglect. Mom and Jessica arrived 10 minutes after us, and the four of us sat in the living room where I'd spent countless childhood evenings, but the atmosphere was nothing like those innocent family gatherings. This felt like a court proceeding where the verdict had already been delivered, and now we were waiting to see what the sentence would be. Jessica broke the silence first, her voice small and defensive. "Sarah, I never meant for things to get so complicated. I genuinely thought you wanted to handle all the practical stuff because you're better at it than me." I stared at her in disbelief. Even now, even after being exposed in front of 50 people, she was still trying to reframe her neglect as a favor to me. "Jessica, you literally texted me last month asking me to handle the boring parts of Grandma's care so you could focus on the meaningful emotional support. How is that me being better at practical stuff?" Mom finally spoke, but instead of addressing what had happened at the reception, she went on the attack. "Sarah, what you did today was cruel and unnecessary. There was no need to humiliate your sister and me in public like that. We could have discussed this privately." The audacity was breathtaking. "Mom, you're the one who chose to humiliate me in public. You stood up in front of 50 people and announced that I never lifted a finger for Grandma. What was I supposed to do? Just sit there and let everyone believe that lie?" "It wasn't a lie," Mom snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. "Jessica did more emotional support than you realize. Just because you handled some logistics doesn't mean." "Some logistics?" I pulled out my phone and started reading from my notes. "I coordinated 14 doctor appointments, managed her medications for 6 months, paid for her groceries and utilities when her fixed income wasn't enough, drove 300 miles every week to check on her, and slept on her couch for the final 3 weeks of her life so she wouldn't die alone. Jessica called twice a week and visited twice in 6 months. Which of those sounds like emotional support to you?" Dad was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, finally seeing the family dynamics that had been playing out under his nose for years. "Linda," he said quietly to Mom, "did you really not know how much Sarah was doing?" Mom's defensive facade cracked slightly. I knew she visited regularly. But Jessica was always telling us about her conversations with Eleanor, about how much comfort she was providing. "Jessica was telling you about 10-minute phone calls where she talked about her job and her boyfriend while I was literally living at Grandma's house," I said flatly. "Did you ever once ask me what my visits were like? Did you ever want to know what Grandma and I talked about during those hours I spent with her every single day? The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. Mom had never asked because she didn't want to know. She preferred Jessica's version of events because it fit the narrative she'd been telling herself for years about which daughter was more loving, more caring, more worthy of praise. And here's what really gets me, I continued, my voice gaining strength. Even if you genuinely believed that Jessica was doing more emotional labor than me, what gave you the right to publicly announce that I never lifted a finger? Even if you thought I was doing less than Jessica, surely you knew I was doing something. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Mom, maybe went a little too far with what you said. A little too far. I laughed bitterly. She tried to completely erase my contributions in front of everyone who mattered to our family. She didn't say I did less than Jessica, or that Jessica did more emotional work. She said I never lifted a finger. Period. She tried to paint me as someone who completely neglected her dying grandmother. Dad was shaking his head slowly, finally understanding the scope of what had happened. Linda, that was cruel. Even if you were upset about something, you don't say something like that about your daughter in public. But Mom wasn't ready to accept responsibility yet. Sarah has always been dramatic about these things. She keeps score, she documents everything, she makes everything about recognition and credit. Jessica just quietly does her part without needing constant validation. Jessica quietly does her part. I pulled up my photo album again. Here's a screenshot of Jessica's Instagram from 2 months ago. She posted a photo of flowers she bought for Grandma with the caption, "Spending Sunday afternoon with my favorite lady." The problem is, those flowers were delivered while Jessica was at brunch with her friends, and I was the one who actually spent Sunday afternoon with Grandma. But Jessica got 43 likes and comments about what a devoted granddaughter she is. The room fell silent again as the full scope of the deception became clear. Jessica hadn't just been doing less work than me, she had been actively misrepresenting her minimal contributions to create the illusion of devotion while I did the actual labor invisibly. And here's what makes it even worse, I continued. I never complained about doing the work. I never asked for recognition or credit. I did it because I loved Grandma and because it was the right thing to do. But when you consistently give someone else credit for your sacrifices, it stops being about love and starts being about exploitation. Mom's face was cycling through emotions again, but I could see something new there, the first glimpse of genuine understanding. Maybe it was seeing Dad's disappointment in her, or maybe it was realizing how many people now knew the truth about our family dynamics, but something was finally penetrating her defensive wall. I need some time to process all of this, she said quietly. I'm still grieving my mother, and this has all been very overwhelming. We're all grieving, Mom, I said gently but firmly. But Grandma died knowing that one granddaughter had been there for her every step of the way, and one granddaughter had performed devotion for an audience while avoiding the actual work. She died knowing which one was which, even if you didn't. Jessica was crying now, finally seeming to understand the weight of what she'd done. Sarah, I'm sorry. I really am. I guess I convinced myself that emotional support was just as important as physical care and that my calls and messages were meaningful contributions. They were meaningful, Jessica, I said, and I meant it. Grandma loved hearing from you, loved knowing you were thinking about her. But emotional support doesn't replace physical presence, and it doesn't excuse you from sharing the actual burden of caregiving. When you let me handle everything while taking credit for being the devoted granddaughter, you weren't providing emotional support, you were performing it. The conversation went on for another hour, with Dad asking increasingly pointed questions about family dynamics he'd somehow missed, Mom slowly beginning to acknowledge the gap between perception and reality, and Jessica grappling with the realization that her entire identity as the good daughter had been built on my invisible labor. By the time I left that night, nothing had been fully resolved, but everything had been fundamentally altered. The old patterns couldn't continue because they'd been exposed too completely. The old narrative couldn't survive because too many people now knew the truth. But most importantly, I couldn't be gaslighted anymore about my own contributions and worth. I had Grandma's validation, the community's recognition, and ironclad documentation of everything I'd done. Nobody could ever again convince me that my sacrifices didn't matter or that my love wasn't real. The reckoning wasn't complete yet, but it had begun. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground instead of constantly shifting sand. 3 months later, I'm sitting in my apartment writing this story, and I can honestly say that Mom's public humiliation was the best thing that ever happened to our family. Not because I enjoyed watching her suffer, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in seeing the truth finally come out, but because it forced everyone to confront realities that had been festering beneath the surface for years. The immediate aftermath was messy, as family reckonings always are. Mom went through what can only be described as a complete emotional breakdown as she realized how wrong she'd been about her own daughters. She spent weeks calling relatives and family friends to clarify what had happened at the reception, but instead of restoring her reputation, these conversations only reinforced how blind she'd been to obvious truths. The turning point came when Aunt Martha, Dad's sister who had watched our family dynamics for decades, finally told Mom what everyone had been thinking, but no one had been willing to say. Linda, we all knew Sarah was doing the heavy lifting. We all saw Jessica taking credit for work she didn't do. We just assumed you knew and were okay with it because you kept praising Jessica and ignoring Sarah's contributions. That conversation shattered Mom's last defense, the idea that she had simply been misinformed about what was happening. She finally had to face the fact that she had willfully ignored evidence that contradicted her preferred narrative about her daughters. The selective blindness hadn't been accidental, it had been a choice. Jessica's reckoning was different, but equally dramatic. Within weeks of the memorial service, word had spread throughout our extended social circle about what had really happened during Grandma's final months. Her carefully cultivated image as the devoted granddaughter crumbled as people began questioning other instances where she'd taken credit for work others had done. Her boyfriend, Marcus, broke up with her after learning that she'd been lying to him for months about her family involvement. Apparently, she'd been using family obligations as an excuse to avoid his social events, while actually using that time for her own activities. When he realized that she'd been performing devotion rather than living it, he couldn't trust her anymore. But the most significant change was in Dad. Learning about the family dynamics he'd missed sparked something in him that I hadn't seen in years. He started paying attention to the actual distribution of family labor instead of just accepting Mom's reports about who was doing what. He began asking me directly about my experiences instead of filtering everything through Mom's interpretations. The result was that for the first time in my adult life, I had a genuine relationship with my father. We started having weekly dinners where we talked about everything. His health struggles, my career ambitions, family history I'd never heard before. He told me stories about Grandma's childhood that she'd shared with him, but never with us grandchildren. He apologized repeatedly for the years he'd spent being emotionally absent while Mom managed the family narrative. I think I was scared of conflict, he admitted during one of our dinners. It was easier to let your mother handle family relationships because I didn't want to deal with hurt feelings or complicated emotions. But that meant I missed out on really knowing my own daughters. The most surprising development was with Jessica. About 6 weeks after the memorial service, she showed up at my apartment with a carefully written letter and a genuine desire to rebuild our relationship. The letter was a detailed acknowledgement of everything she'd done wrong, including specific instances where she'd taken credit for my work, times when she'd avoided responsibilities she'd committed to, and the ways she'd enabled Mom's favoritism because it benefited her. I realized that I became addicted to being seen as the perfect daughter, she wrote. It felt so good to be praised and admired that I didn't want to look too closely at whether I was actually earning that recognition. I convinced myself that my intentions were good, so the details of my actions didn't matter as much. She also revealed something that shocked me. She'd been struggling with anxiety and depression for years, and part of her avoidance of Grandma's care had been because she couldn't handle confronting mortality and decline. She'd used emotional support as a way to feel involved without having to face the reality of death and dying. I know that doesn't excuse anything, she said when she came to talk about the letter. But I wanted you to understand that my avoidance wasn't because I didn't love Grandma. It was because I was too scared and selfish to deal with losing her. We're still rebuilding our relationship, and it's not easy. There are years of resentment and hurt feelings to work through. But for the first time, we're having honest conversations about family dynamics instead of performing our assigned roles. Jessica is seeing a therapist and working on understanding why she'd rather be praised for fake contributions than acknowledged for real ones. I'm learning to set boundaries and speak up when I see old patterns emerging. Mom's transformation has been the most dramatic of all. The woman who spent years telling me I was too dramatic and ungrateful has become someone who asks detailed questions about my experiences and validates my feelings even when they're critical of her past behavior. She started seeing a counselor too, working on understanding why she'd been so invested in a false narrative about her daughters that she'd ignored obvious evidence to the contrary. I think I wanted Jessica to be the daughter I'd been to my own mother, she explained during one of our difficult but healing conversations. Someone naturally nurturing and family-oriented. When you turned out to be more independent and career-focused, I interpreted that as you caring less about family instead of you showing love differently. She's also working on understanding how her constant comparisons affected both of us. I damaged both my daughters, she realized. I made you feel invisible and unappreciated, but I also set Jessica up to fail by praising her for superficial gestures instead of encouraging her to develop real caregiving skills. The community response has been overwhelmingly supportive. People who witnessed the memorial service drama have gone out of their way to acknowledge my contributions and check in on how I'm doing. Mrs. Henderson invited me to join Grandma's Old Book Club, where I've found a group of women who appreciate quiet devotion over public performance. Father Martinez asked me to help coordinate the church's ministry to elderly parishioners, recognizing that I have both the skills and the heart for that kind of service. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Last month, I received a package from Grandma's lawyer containing items she'd specifically left for me in her will, her recipe collection, her garden journals, and a small monetary inheritance that she'd kept secret from the family. The note that accompanied the package was brief but powerful, for Sarah, who understood that love is a verb, not a feeling. Use this to build the life you deserve. That inheritance, combined with the emotional clarity I've gained from finally standing in my truth, gave me the courage to make some major life changes. I applied for a promotion at work that I'd been avoiding because it would require more travel and potentially less availability for family obligations. I got the job, along with a significant salary increase and the opportunity to use my organizational skills on a larger scale. I also started dating again, something I'd put on hold during Grandma's illness. I'm seeing someone who appreciates my caretaking nature but doesn't take advantage of it, who sees my quiet devotion as a strength rather than something to exploit. He's met my family and been amazed by the transformation he's witnessed in our dynamics. It's like watching people discover who they really are after years of playing characters, he observed after our first family dinner together. Your mom seems genuinely different, like she's trying to see clearly for the first time. The most healing part of this entire experience has been realizing that Grandma saw everything all along. Reading her journals in detail revealed that she'd been documenting the family dynamics not just to record her own experiences, but to leave evidence of the truth in case it was ever needed. She'd known that Mom's favoritism was damaging both daughters, and she'd hoped that someday the family would develop better vision. Her final gift to me wasn't just validation, it was permission to stop accepting crumbs and start demanding the recognition I deserved. She'd seen me sacrificing my own needs to maintain family peace, and she'd wanted me to understand that real love doesn't require martyrdom. Today marks exactly 3 months since that memorial service, and I can honestly say that having my mother announce my worthlessness in front of 50 people was the catalyst for the most positive changes my family has ever experienced. The public humiliation forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths that had been festering for years. The documentation I'd been keeping gave me the evidence I needed to defend myself against gaslighting. And Grandma's journals provided the validation I needed to stand firm in my truth. The sweetest part of this entire revenge story isn't that I proved my worth to people who had dismissed me, it's that I finally stopped needing their validation to know my own value. The public recognition was satisfying, sure, But the real victory was learning to see myself clearly instead of through the distorted lens of family dysfunction. So here's my question for all of you watching this story. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family, doing all the work while someone else gets all the credit? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself? And most importantly, have you ever discovered that the people you thought didn't see your worth were actually just choosing not to acknowledge it? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Did karma eventually catch up in your situation, or are you still waiting for justice? How did you find the courage to stop being invisible and start demanding recognition? Your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps other people find these stories when they need them most. And definitely subscribe because I'm planning to share more stories about family dynamics, setting boundaries, and the complex relationship between love and obligation. There are so many lessons I learned from this experience that I want to explore in future videos. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their invisible labor matters, that their sacrifices are seen even when they're not acknowledged, and that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones who need to learn how to see us clearly. Thank you all for listening to my family revenge story and for understanding that sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth finally being acknowledged. I hope that whatever family dynamics you're navigating, you find the courage to stand in your truth and demand the recognition you deserve. From someone who learned that love should be measured by actions rather than performances, that family loyalty should flow both ways, and that the most powerful revenge is living authentically instead of invisibly, I wish you the strength to see your own worth clearly, the wisdom to demand better treatment, and the peace that comes from knowing that your contributions matter, whether or not they're acknowledged by the people who should be seeing them. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you don't have to earn love by disappearing. The right people will see you clearly and appreciate what you bring to their lives.